Hey there, Darin Garman here, and I want to welcome you to this week's Paranoid Banker podcast. It is great to have you with me today. And wow, this time of year is fantastic. I'm looking out the window right now as I'm recording this podcast, and it's October. The leaves are changing, just absolutely beautiful. Weather's getting a little more crispy temperature-wise. Days are getting a little bit shorter, nights a little bit longer, and it's definitely fall, one of my favorite times of the year. And so I am glad that you joined me today and appreciate you being with me. In following with our theme of the month, the strange but true stories, I've got a good one for you. I'd call it a doozy. If you didn't listen to last week's podcast, I talked about a strange but true story of how I actually stole a book in the prison I used to work in Anamosa, Iowa, the Iowa Men's Reformatory. And actually, well, really, as a result of really stealing and reading that book, you're listening to this podcast right now, is if you really want to boil it down to the very, very bottom, that's really it. So yeah, and hopefully that you got a chance to listen on how I was working in the prison and got that book and had to visit the warden due to some disciplinary things possibly going on there. And if you haven't had a chance to listen to that podcast, you really want to. I think not only is it's kind of funny and entertaining, but I think there's actually even maybe a couple of lessons in there too. So hopefully you've had a chance to listen to that. If you haven't, I'd really recommend you go back and listen to that podcast. And this week's installment of Strange But True, following our October-themed Strange But True stories, has to do with something outside of real estate. And actually, it has to do with the prison. And what I thought I would do is give you a couple of really good outside of the prison stories, outside of real estate stories that had to do with the prison that I worked in. And I think this one is a great segue to the story of the book that I talked about in last week's podcast, the book that I stole from prison. And this story has to do with the Dallas Cowboy Cheerleaders. And so you may be thinking, Dallas Cowboy Cheerleaders, what does that have to do with a prison in Iowa? And what does that have to do with you working in a prison in Iowa? A hell of a lot. And let me tell you the story, because it's unbelievable. So let's go back to my days working at the prison. So when I worked there, one of my jobs was I was in charge of what was called Pictures in the Yard. So Pictures in the Yard was every third Saturday of the month at 2 o'clock, just like clockwork, 2 in the afternoon, inmates could get their pictures taken. In the wintertime, they would get them taken inside in an auditorium. In the spring through fall, it would be outside in the yard. And so my job every third Saturday of every month at 2 o'clock was to stand there and do two things. One, make sure that inmates paid for their picture to get their picture taken. And I'll tell you why actually inmates would pay for getting their picture taken in a minute and what that's all about. So to make sure the inmates paid, no freebies. And the second thing was I was to make sure when the inmates got their picture taken, they couldn't do things like gang signs. They couldn't, moon the camera. They couldn't expose themselves, nothing like that. They had to actually take decent pictures. So that was my job. Basically babysitting inmates for 2.5 hours, making sure they didn't do anything goofy. That's really it. And as like a side note, the reason why inmates would actually pay to get their pictures taken is there's a group in the prison, a group of inmates, and their name was, they go by the name of Inmate Council. And I would compare Inmate Council to really a booster club. So think of Inmate Council as the booster club of inmates. So what inmate council would do is have activities that would raise money for them to bring in movies for inmates to watch. So every weekend, a different movie was shipped into the prison, and the inmates got to watch them in the auditorium. Well, how they paid for those movies was through Pictures in the Yard. And so every inmate to get their picture taken would pay $1 to get their picture taken. Okay? And so, again, this goes on for, a couple of years I'm dealing with this. And by the way, it's not hard work, but it's the definition of monotonous, right? So after a couple of years, I decided I would make it a little bit interesting. And so how we would let inmates know that Pictures in the Yard were coming up the following Saturday afternoon was I'd have an inmate worker of mine, basically make a poster. The poster would say, Pictures in the Yard, Saturday, 2 to 4:30, and that's basically it. So the inmate worker would make the poster, then they'd make a bunch of copies, and the copies would be distributed throughout the prison. In the work areas, cell houses, the chow hall, all those places, okay? So that way all the inmates would always know. So this also went on about every Wednesday or Thursday, the third Wednesday or Thursday of the month. Get the poster done, get it out, get it posted up. Okay. So one day I decided to make it interesting. If you know me, I do have a sense of humor. And it gets me into trouble sometimes. Well, this is no exception. So inmates were making the poster for